Well, we've got about a third of the people that had signed up, but we know that generally on an online thing, you're not getting everybody that signed up. But just want to say good evening to everyone and welcome to the second session of Forward Nanaimo 22, Housing in a Safe and Compassionate Nanaimo. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the Regional District of Nanaimo is situated on the traditional territories of the Nanaimo, the Snaawis, Stimonis, Qualicum, Hopucheset, and Comox First Nations. We recognize the historical and ongoing injustices perpetrated by the colonial system against the Indigenous peoples that have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. We understand that living and working on these lands means we have a responsibility to strive for meaningful nation-to-nation relationships between our colonial governments and First Nations and care for and protect the land, water, and air we all rely on. My name's Jason Harrison. I'll be your moderator this evening. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Mental Health Association Mid-Island Branch and was also part of the organizing committee for these sessions. I've worked in Nanaimo for approximately 13 years, currently serving as the Nanaimo Community Advisory Board co-chair, which oversees the federal funds allocated to Nanaimo through Reaching Home. And I was also a member of the Health and Housing Task Force. We're hoping the workshop series will help build foundational knowledge on local issues and become a driver of positive action amongst candidates in the upcoming 2022 municipal elections. Our format this evening will be to have our three presenters provide some context to the issues of housing for about 25 minutes. Then we'll provide 10 or 15 minutes of question and answer before moving into the breakout rooms for around 20 minutes of discussion. If there's less questions, we can move to discussion and we have some ability to flex there if need be. And then we'll end with the last 15 minutes or so back in the large group to share the outcome of the discussions and talk about what comes next. A little bit of housekeeping. Any questions that you have as you go through, please put them in the chat and we'll gather those and pose them back to the panelists after the presentation portion. We are recording the session and we're making the recording publicly available so that the great ideas shared tonight can reach as many people as possible. We may also use some of the input provided by everyone here in future communications with election candidates or elected officials. However, we won't attribute statements to anyone by name unless we ask for your permission first. And in this Zoom world that we're in, if you could please remain on mute unless you're part of the panel. Then just obviously off mute when you get into the breakout rooms for the discussion. We've got three great panelists this evening. I'm just going to introduce them all before we turn it over to them. First, we have Erin Hemmons, and she's a counselor with the City of Nanaimo, director with the Regional District of Nanaimo, vice chair of the Nanaimo Regional Hospital District Board, and the vice chair of the Vancouver Island Regional Library Board. And in addition, she co-chaired the City of Nanaimo Health and Housing Task Force through her work as a counselor. We have Andrew Thornton, PhD, who has a research-focused background in sociology and equity studies at the University of Toronto. Andrew has helped coordinate the Reaching Home point in time counts on behalf of the Nanaimo Homeless Coalition in both 2018 and 2020. In addition, he recently completed a study of housing and homelessness, which compared Nanaimo to 10 similarly sized communities in Canada. And in partnership with our third panelist, he's also established the Nanaimo Center for Justice, Education, and Research. And our third panelist is John McCormick, and he is a community development specialist, former executive director for the Nanaimo Region John Howard Society. He was a member of the Health and Housing Task Force and is part of the transition team to create the Systems Planning Organization Charter. He's also managing director of the Nanaimo Center for Justice, Education, and Research. And with that, I believe I am turning it over to Andrew to begin by giving us some context surrounding Nanaimo and how it compares to other communities in Canada and North America. Andrew, floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jason. I'm going to focus quite primarily on the study that I just completed to contextualize what's going on in Nanaimo. And therefore, we're going to be focusing on housing and homelessness because one goes with the other. I don't think in this day and age we can begin to talk about one without the other. And in particular, so what I did in this study and what I think we're all interested in as well is where do we stand? So in this study that I did that is based on data that's widely publicly available and is indicative research. It's not the final nail in the coffin of what's going on with housing and homelessness in Nanaimo. It is really intended, one of the things it's intended to do is to start the conversation about what kind of factors should we be looking at to try to understand with what's going on in Nanaimo. And when we compared Nanaimo to 10 communities in Canada that are about the same size and that are also incidentally also reaching home designated communities, Nanaimo came out first on these measures. In particular, the ones that are quite important for us was the per capita homeless. Nanaimo is by quite a wide margin the highest per capita homeless in Canada of these size communities and of almost all communities, although there are some very small communities that have relatively large numbers of, communities of 5,000 that have about, 50 homeless. So if you do their prorated basis, it comes out very high. But for medium-sized communities, Nanaimo is definitely number one. And what is of interest for us here today is to begin to think, what are those determinants? What are the kind of social, political, financial determinants that have ended Nanaimo in this kind of unenviable but widely acknowledged place of having such a severe problem? And in particular, one of the things that is relevant for thinking about what's going on with housing in Nanaimo is the so-called livability. And as we all know, a lot of people come here who can come here of their own volition precisely for these so-called livability factors: the weather, the access to the outdoors, the access to recreation, and historically relatively low property values, which in the last 2 to 3 years have, as everyone knows, kind of skyrocketed in some sense out of control. One of the other things that we also know is there's relatively little rental stock in Nanaimo. There's been some built in the last 2 to 3 years, but this has been snapped up quite quickly and is not necessarily addressing our issue of homelessness and affordability. Although there's been some initiatives to address this at both the municipal and the provincial level. And so what we have in Nanaimo is, and increasingly in many places in Canada, unfortunately, is exactly a perfect storm, which I know is a bit of an overused metaphor, of housing insecurity. And this will just give you some idea, and if you had a chance to have a read through the report, that Nanaimo's homelessness per 100,000 is much, much higher than anywhere else in these large or these medium-sized cities in Canada. And the other thing that's going on with Nanaimo's homelessness is that it's in the report, it's continuing to increase, whereas many places it's increasing, but not as much, or it's stabilizing. Even places like Victoria, Vancouver, and Calgary, which are very big and have hundreds, if not thousands of homeless, they are at least beginning to stabilize. Even through COVID, their numbers, they're not necessarily going down, but they're stabilizing. But Nanaimo's is continuing to increase on a regular basis. And in 2020, the per capita homeless, according to the PIC count, was over 420. So it's increased by another 30% in that period. and likely due to COVID has probably increased again. So I can talk more about that as I go through the stuff. But in the some of the other drivers of homelessness, as you know, in Nanaimo, one of the key things that's also an issue across Canada, but particularly in the West, particularly on Vancouver Island, is average rent prices. And in the study, I show that between 2015 and 2020, rents in Nanaimo increased over 40% on average. That's not for every single type. That's the overall average of all rentals in Nanaimo. So obviously that's going to be a fairly severe problem for the housing market that is not necessarily building enough rental stock fast enough. And one of the things, and I'm happy to discuss all of this and more from the context. One of the things that this is not in the study, but that is emerging, and I think is important in thinking about what's going on in Nanaimo and how we might be able to address that and think about what's going on in Nanaimo, is obviously people who live on incomes below 40,000 a year are always going to be in some sort of economic crisis, especially when it comes to housing. But what we see in this graph and I wanted to point out is Nanaimo has twice the national average of people with incomes over 100,000. Now I know $100,000 is not what it used to be, but what's important about that, clearly people with incomes over 100,000, their housing affordability is a radically different thing from people with incomes under 40 or under 20. And if Nanaimo has this kind of skewed income distribution in its population, it's likely going to have a skewed set of housing developments as well, because housing is not currently being built for people who are on the left-hand side of this graph, but at least it's being built for more of, not necessarily everyone, at 100,000 a year. And obviously that's a structural thing. We can't change who comes here, although I think in some ways we can. I think that's what the OCP is about in some sense. But it's something to pay attention to. It's a factor we can begin to see if this graph begins to normalize a bit for Nanaimo and the distribution begins to become more symmetrical. We can get into a debate about, normal curves and all that, but clearly there's an issue here that needs to be addressed, and that issue is there's a group of the population in Nanaimo whose needs are clearly not being met by the current housing policies of the city, the province, and the feds. I can see Jason's put his hand up, so I'm done for now.
Thanks, Andrew, for giving us that context. Now I'm going to turn it over to John to give us a little bit of the basics of the big picture, including the responsibilities at each different level of government, federal, provincial, and municipal. John, go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. It is really, as Andrew said, Nanaimo is unique. And so I think it's really important for us to understand the bigger context. And what's interesting for me about Nanaimo is that it wasn't like that 20 years ago. Back 25 years ago when I moved out west, it was a hub city. It was a terminus for the ferry and a regional hub. And now it's different. It's become a destination, retirement community, a safe harbor, and it has a moat between it and the rest of the country and the continent and the world. And so it's really interesting how this dynamic is really affecting the nature of the housing situation in Nanaimo. So for me, what Nanaimo has, the business of what Nanaimo is now is all about housing. Everyone, the entire world is interested in moving to Vancouver Island and to Nanaimo, and it's putting huge pressure on all aspects of housing. And as Andrew has indicated, that is reflected in the type of building that's going on in the city itself. So just in terms of the context of the levels of government and their roles and responsibilities, the federal government obviously has a central role in providing funding for affordable housing, for social housing and homelessness programs. And it does provide some homelessness initiatives, but they're relatively modest compared to the role that it historically played in the post-war period. That said, it has funds about 70 billion worth of dollars in terms of the national housing strategy, and the federal rapid housing initiative dedicated 2.5 billion originally, and there's been additional funds added to that as a result of a response to COVID. So, and most of that was directed directly to municipalities to across the country in just about 24 months or so, from 2020 to this year. In that way, the federal government's entered into sort of direct relationships in some cases with social housing providers across the country, in Toronto in particular. CMHA, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, is part of the federal mix, and it sometimes enters into bilateral agreements with the provinces, and that in a way kind of sidesteps municipal involvement. That adds another $7.5 billion to the spending on housing. But clearly, it's really the primary responsibility for addressing issues related to housing comes down to the provinces. They have really the most important policy levers, and so it's really up to the provinces to really effectively move these things along. They control the levers for regulating municipal action. They are responsible for the funding in many cases. The other piece that's really important in that regard is that the really essential tool requires intergovernmental cooperation. The fact that the federal government and provinces get along or don't get along on housing issues is really significant. We've had, certainly in Nanaimo, we've had the experience of trying to figure out how to respond to federal funding or a requirement of federal funding that has been problematic for BC, where it's been not so difficult in other provinces. The other piece of the cooperation factor is the gathering of data, and that's actually one of those issues that we've had challenges with. If you can hear a cat in the background, it just entered into my workspace, so I apologize. It is really important that we have the gathering of good quality data that allows us to really understand what's going on at the local level. And this really is a problem right now for a place like Nanaimo. We just don't know what's happening on a real-time basis. So the third level of government, municipal governments, the city of Nanaimo, legally are sort of, their responsibilities are set by the province. Across the country, each province and territory has its own set of legislative and regulatory frameworks that control municipal housing functions, and often in highly restrictive ways that prescribe how municipalities operate. So this makes for a sort of a limited capacity of municipalities to really be able to respond in proactive ways. That said, it is possible. Vancouver's Making Home initiative is a good example of that. And I think that it's something to watch for as we move forward. There are in Nanaimo, it's tricky. The city itself has limited supply of housing. Aaron can certainly go into that in more detail. It relies on property taxes. It's prohibited from levying income and other progressive taxes. So those are restrictions that are quite well known. And partly for that reason, it's really the provincial government that plays a role in major capital projects. And in that regard, here in BC, it's really the responsibility principally of BC Housing, which is, as we know, a provincial crown corporation. There are similar versions of that in other provinces like Saskatchewan Housing Corporation, Housing Nova Scotia, Manitoba Housing. So generally speaking, any municipal-led initiative almost inevitably requires some kind of multi-level of governmental participation and cooperation, and it means that while those municipalities might be interested in trying to get some of this work going, it really does require a commitment and a relationship that's functioning and really functional between the provincial government and the federal government. So I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss that in more detail. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, John. Sort of following up on that, obviously a lot of the funding is coming from the federal and provincial levels of government. Andrew, can you share with us some of the different approaches municipal governments are taking with some of the levers that they have?
Yes, I know I have to unmute myself. There we go. Some of them have already been mentioned. There are, in fact, all kinds. Let's run through that again. You can read these, but I think the key is there are any number. This idea of a rental only zoning is not all that new, but it's important that it has been instituted in BC already. The inclusionary zoning bylaws, this is also not necessarily brand new, but being used more and more, although it has problems as well, because at least in my humble opinion, setting aside 10 or 20% of all new developments for so-called affordable is fine. But if they're only 10% below market value rents, that's still not affordable, especially in Toronto, where the affordable rents for inclusionary zoning are set on a prorated basis for average rents in Toronto, not related to wages, not related to social assistance. And as you know, rents in Toronto are kind of out of control. They're more straightforward, but also not so obvious, but really important things that cities can do that's being done in, like I have here, Peterborough and Lethbridge. Cities are providing direct IT support to different housing and homelessness organizations, SPOs, housing authorities, so on and so forth. And that's really important work that can be a kind of a barrier to getting the work done, simply because that otherwise you have to go out and build your own IT infrastructure, which, as probably many of you know, is often not the most straightforward or simple thing or a cheap thing to do either. The number one thing that we see across not just Canada, but North America, where stuff that municipalities can do is around advocacy and leadership, or what people call it convening. These are all, in my mind, interchangeable. And in particular, as we know, if you're paying attention, Victoria has actually become a capital investor in housing. And that was before the pandemic. They had gone out and borrowed money against their own reserves. And then they brought that, they had money, and then they went to the province and the feds chipped in some, and the province chipped in some. So that's one potential. And also, if you read the newspapers, Vancouver is recently doing this test pilot of multiple dwellings on a single lot. Again, I can recall the 70s and 80s. I'm just old enough, where density was a bad word, and this kind of project would have been, urban swamping of the environment, sort of thing. But that's not the case anymore. We're in a situation where density is, as long as it's done in some sort of reasonable fashion, again, reasonable in quotes, or sensible or organized or focused, then we're going to get this kind of approach and in some sense, it may make sense. If we have huge, and some of the lots we're talking about in Vancouver are, places in that have very large lots. They're not just little 3,000 square foot city lots that they're going to jam 6 homes on. And the advice, again, of what's happening is this, as John has said, is more research and analysis. And I'm not just saying that because I'm interested in research and analysis. And I mean research, when I talk about research and analysis that we can do, some of that's being done now. And that's including people from all sectors of the community, not just people who have stuff to do with housing. We want to talk to people in health, we want to talk to people in education, faith communities. We want to have, of course, the First Nations communities involved and the First Nation itself locally, and people with lived experience of homelessness and other forms of marginalization. So those are the kinds of things that definitely the city can be leading on, and is starting to do those things, and will be, I think, will be mentioned in the discussion of the OCP. There are lots of other things that are happening in other communities and in other parts of the world. Although it's in the US and it's a state thing, the state of California has introduced a 1%, I think, on sales tax, and that goes directly to social housing. So there are things like that that the city could advocate on, or with the province and the feds, and that's not insignificant. Because you probably know, California has the economy is like as big as countries in Europe. It's not an insignificant thing to say 1% sales tax that goes to social housing. And the other thing I will end, and these conversations have already started as well in Nanaimo, is a kind of what they're talking about is a regionalization of these discussions. So when we're talking about Nanaimo, we're not just talking about Nanaimo, we're talking about the regional district. And we're talking about the regional district within the Central Island, within the Vancouver Island, and within its interconnections with the mainland. And that has come out because the regional district of Nanaimo has done a housing needs survey last year. And you can read that to get a vision of kind of the future perspective needs of housing in the regional district. I see Jason's hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And so we've given a bit of the context of what's going on in Nanaimo, how the different levels of government connect to each other, what the roles potentially of a municipality can be in that whole group. And now we'll turn it over to Aaron to hear a little bit about the City of Nanaimo approaches to health and housing and planning, and some about the Reimagine Nanaimo.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason, and hello, everyone. Really happy to be here tonight. I have the task of providing a 5-minute synopsis of everything the city's doing to do with housing, and I could take 5 days. So I want to preface this with saying I've only been doing this work for 3 years, and it's a part of what I do in my work. There are people here tonight who have much greater experience. So I welcome people to challenge what I'm saying or say, you have that wrong. It really is about having a conversation. So I'll just dive in. Planning is really the language of the city. And this is one of the things I've learned. And I'm thinking about for municipal candidates coming forward, if you want to understand how the city looks at housing, you need to understand how the city plans, because planning is the language of the city. So Nanaimo has 3 primary plans related to homelessness or housing. The first is the Affordable Housing Strategy. The second is the Health and Housing Action Plan, which is co-owned by the community. That's not a city piece. And then we have Reimagine, which is a big land use planning document that is currently being drafted right now. The Affordable Housing Strategy is where we get those levers that we can pull on, like rental only zoning, which is in our OCP. We haven't enacted it yet, but the Affordable Housing Strategy is where we understand the policy levers we have to increase affordable housing in our community. So just an example or a couple examples, the strategy was was developed in 2018, and since then we've had some policy work on short-term rentals. So we're trying to pull people, or units that are being used either for short-term rentals or not being used at all. We're trying to pull them back into the market. So we're increasing the rental stock thereby. We've supported the creation of a rent bank, which was in the 2008 Affordable Housing Strategy. And the big one for me is we've written our community amenity contribution policy. What this is when a developer comes to the city of Nanaimo and they develop, there's an agreement. It's not formal. It says it's a policy, but it's not. Developers don't have to do it, but developers give a community amenity contribution when they bring business into the city, and we give them a whole bunch of different things that they can choose in terms of the amenity that we would like to see in our city. We get funding from the developers attached to that. So for every unit with our new policy, we have dramatically increased the contribution to affordable housing. So when developers come in and we say, okay, this is what your contribution will be, we've now created policy that will carve off a huge portion of that to go to our Housing Legacy Reserve Fund, which will result in programming like the rent bank, which will result in us having a land acquisition strategy, et cetera, et cetera. The Health and Housing Action Plan is really about homelessness. And that was a collaboration with Nanaimo, Island Health, RCMP, the feds, the province, BC Housing, the business sector, service providers. A number of you were on that. It was 20 months, and I want to go back to Andrew and John saying data is so important to understanding our challenges here. And the Health and Housing Action Plan, along with Andrew and John's work around their research, is really the most recent data we have, the current picture in Nanaimo. So some highlights from that for me were we have 6,000 plus families in core housing need in Nanaimo. I won't give you the definition of core housing need, but I will say they're one paycheck away from losing their homes. We have 6,000 plus people living in that scenario right now. We're under-resourced. That plan also told us that we have a deficit of $62 million if we want to build the services in the sector that we need to build to serve the population we have right now. And that under-resourcing is a really key piece when we're talking about relationships and how the community functions. And the last piece I'll say about the Health and Housing Action Plan is that it put us on a path to get to the systems planning organization, which was one of the recommendations of that plan. And John and I will tell you a little bit more about that coming up, but that's a piece of, that's something really hopeful, I think, for our community that's coming up. Reimagine, massive engagement, big picture ideas. We have a huge section on affordable housing. I would personally recommend that you go look at C3.1.11, which is develop that land acquisition strategy. So we have a really clear understanding of what land we have, what is it available for, what needs to be zoned for what, et cetera, et cetera. So that strategy is important. Also interesting, 3.1.17, support development of projects with innovative and affordable forms of home ownership or rent. And I'm really curious if that means cooperative. There's a June 27th meeting of City Council where we are going to get an update on all things affordable housing and Health and Housing Action Plan. So I recommend for people interested in this topic, you should tune in on June 27th to GPC. And one thing I want to say about the policy piece, things are happening in Saanich, things are happening in Burnaby, things are happening in New Westminster. The suite of policies that we have in the city of Nanaimo have been designed in the context of the city of Nanaimo. And so I don't, oh, there's Jason's hand. I'm not even close, Jason. I think what I want to say there is that no one city.
Take the time you need, Erin. Take the time you need.
Thanks, Jason.
It's important.
Thank you.
It's important.
Thank you. What I want to say about that policy piece is that there is no silver bullet. There isn't a policy that if we did that, we would be doing better. Or if we did what Toronto did, if we did what Medicine Hat did, all of those policies are developed in the context of the cities that they're in. So we want to borrow, we want to beg, borrow, and steal. We want to see what innovations are out there. But I actually believe we have good planning documents in place to see us through. These big sounds. I'm going to be really quick. Briefly, we have an MOU that's bringing in 300 new affordable homes to the city in order to really deal with the numbers we have on the street, we need about 3 more MOUs. And the one MOU that we signed in 2019 that brought the 300 units to us, the first one with, I believe, 59 units was just opened a few weeks ago. So another thing I want to share is that my friend Don, when he jumps in, oh, sorry, Heather, memorandum of understanding. Thank you, Heather. So that's where the BC Housing and the city say, we're going to work together, and this is what BC Housing is going to provide, and this is what the city's going to provide. So we're behind on that, and we can't count on MOUs with the province to solve this for us. So that's something I want to say. Also, we can't count on policy to solve the feeling that we have downtown or the fences that we have downtown. It can't resolve the interface, that really tricky interface between business and the unhoused population, who are, many of them, experiencing tremendous oh gosh, anxiety. Like when you're homeless, you're not functioning at your best, right? And I hate to categorize, but what we have going on downtown, the plans that we have are not going to solve them. So I think what I want to share with you guys is that the work we're doing is good. The resource issue is really, really big. We simply don't have the resources to send people to, and that's incredibly frustrating. I'll take a bylaw example. So, bylaws breaks up an encampment, and we can talk forever and a day about why and how that happens. But without actually having somewhere to send those people to, that can actually be a really traumatic experience, not just for the people experiencing it, but for the bylaw officers. So what we have going on right now does not work for anyone. The plans we have in place are not quite going to get us through what we face. The numbers, like Andrew said, it's grown 144% since we started counting at the point in time. I have so much to say. Lastly, and I'll let John talk about the systems planning organization, but one of the key things that I really took away from 20 months of working every second week with these folks and working with Dr. Alina Turner on that plan is that we need more money, and the money coming into the community, if we could work ourselves around that money differently, work it more effectively, we could serve more people. So we don't have enough, and if we use it differently, we can serve more people. So ultimately, the systems planning organization, which John will tell you about, is an effort to try to really coordinate the money that is coming into the community, and also to create the story that's going to allow us to go to the government and say, here are the resources we really need. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. The SPO, I think, will be the quarterback of the community. One of the things we heard is that, and I know in our social service sector, our providers are starved for funding. They're writing grant proposals every year, and it's not conducive to providing good community care. So the SPO, in my opinion, is going to take over some of that quarterbacking, and hopefully allow the service providers to do what they do best, which is provide service to the community and not be burdened with administrative tasks. Very, very quickly, I want everyone to read Julie Chadwick's coverage of the rental crisis in Nanaimo. I think that's a really good piece of information. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. You had a very tough task. We'll turn it over to John just to hear a little bit about the system planning organization concept and how that might help us create the plans for what we need to do to address both the funding gap, the resource gap, all of those types of things. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, and thanks, Erin, for sort of placing it in context, because when we did the work through the Health and Housing Task Force, which, as Erin said, took about 20 months. Now we're in a transition team where we're getting closer to actually launching the systems planning organization as a concept and idea. And I think it's going to council on May 2nd. Is that right, Erin? For a reading of the charter that the draft charter that we've come up with. The reality of why that made sense to us, that the concept made sense of a systems planning organization, is that the city was struggling to try and figure out how to kind of lead this. Community agencies like Canadian Mental Health Association, John Howard Society, Salvation Army, they're very sort of pinned down doing the work that they do. So they couldn't really represent the overall needs of the community. And there was this very large gap in terms of need to sort of move this effort forward, and there was no one to do it. And so we started doing work on what this SPO was about 8 or 9 months ago, I guess, in the spring. And where we've come to is that really the purpose of it is to provide sort of a consultancy of sorts that allows us to have the research and data and analysis, the education, information related to the community's sort of collective homelessness prevention and responses that really, as Aaron said, allow us to have a coordinated action and advocacy by that's really rooted in the nonprofit organizations, Nanaimo First Nation, and in other levels of government, and as well as the business sector and the broader community, because we all have a role to play in this, toward the effort of trying to address homelessness in Nanaimo. As Aaron said, the numbers are really concerning. I think when I did the simple math on the back of an envelope, it's about 15 new people per month who are homeless in Nanaimo. And if Andrew, based on the pit count, a large number of those people are people who are in Nanaimo, who can no longer afford to live in a rental unit or have lost their housing. So it's a significant number of people per month. So we really, as a community, need to figure this out. It's not just for government to figure it out. It's not just for the community agencies to figure it out. So really, that is for us the purpose of the SPO, and the vision really is basically that that housing is a right, that all people, regardless of their background, situation, or past experiences, can access a full spectrum of health and housing services, all the things that we would hope that we would have as Canadians. This means that responses are coordinated and resources are aligned to ensure that homelessness is prevented whenever possible. And that means things like both diversion, which means trying to help people to not end up homeless, and prevention, and also then finding housing for people and having the actual available stock so that we can actually house people. So that if they are homeless, that it's rare, brief, and a non-reoccurring experience. So I'll leave it at that. That's essentially the work of the SPO, and hopefully it will be up and running in about in sometime, hopefully by September, if not a little bit sooner than that. So it is now sort of ramped up to hyperspeed after doing a lot of very heavy lifting, and we're looking forward to seeing the impact of that over the next several years. And just in passing, the city of Nanaimo is funding the creation and development and operation of the SPO for the next 5 years. And I think it's a really good investment in the effort to try and address homelessness. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I think we'll just quickly transition into some questions here. I think you made some comments around, well, both, all the panelists did, but made some comments around those that are that one paycheck away. There's the access and rights issues. There's a question in the chat. It was an announcement that came out of Ontario about the really bad housing and accommodation issues that seniors who are going to be living to be 95, as our lives are getting longer on average, there's not enough planning there because there's a lot of folks can't survive on the pension that's based on the average age of 80. How can Nanaimo find and build affordable housing for folks on that end of the spectrum? And I'm glad people are bringing that up, because often the attention goes to the disruption piece, whereas there are many, many, many more people in need that you're not seeing in downtown Nanaimo. And that's open to anybody on the panel to jump in. John, Andrew.
I think actually I'm going to suggest that Andrew would probably be good to start this one off.
I like it. Andrew.
I think all of the above of what the suggestions, because, and I'm not dodging the question. What happens is what Jason just said is we begin to talk about housing and homelessness, and we focus in on one piece. And what there's a multitude of a continuum of issues, and one of those is seniors housing. One of those is housing for affordable housing for low income people. One of those is housing for homeless people. And when we begin to address one piece of that, the other piece will, because we do live in a highly interconnected world, that doesn't make it necessarily any better, as we're finding out, but that is going to make some impact on seniors housing, because when we solve one piece of the problem, we begin to open up space for solving the other. Nanaimo doesn't have enough land, as far as I understand it. So one of the solutions at some point is going to be the redrawing of boundaries. I hate to be too abstract, but and beginning to think about those regional things. Because I actually wrote a paper about aging and social service delivery a few years back. And what it is a major issue. It is the paper was called The Gray Tsunami, and I wasn't being rude, but this is coming. I mean, Patty points out a very important thing that in some, I think in 10, 15 or 20 years, between 15 and 20% of the population is actually going to be over 85 years old. This is not just a housing issue. This is perhaps as important as anything else that's going on in the world right now. And so I don't have a solution, but I think putting it on the map as part of the conversation is a way forward to that. I think the things that support people aging in place, although, you know, aging in place as you get over, again, my mother's 86 or whatever, becomes more and more difficult. But those kind of supports that support that, not necessarily housing, but simple things like increasing the GIS, increasing OAS, which again, the city can't do, but the city can advocate with the province can advocate with the feds, and also start building more seniors homes, not seniors home, but accommodation that can accommodate people who don't need, well, no one needs a 4,000 square foot house, but I digress, but that are appropriate to people's desires and conditions that would enable them to live best. And that is the other thing that people talk a lot about is promoting and supporting intentional communities of various kinds, and especially for seniors who can decide, like, I would like to live, you know, with only women, or, you know, I want to live in a rural area. I don't want to live in a city anymore. To create those kind of enabling factors, especially in Nanaimo that has both urban, semi-rural, and rural, and remote kinds of communities in it. So that's kind of a bit of a dodge, but that's the best I can do on short notice.
I think it's just the biggest piece for me is looking at and addressing the continuum, and as the continuum changes as well. All of those pieces. There was a question.
Just Jason, if I can just jump in on that too. When one of the pieces I talked about is it is up to all of us to try and figure this out as a community as well. And I'm going to suggest that we actually the supply problem is a designated supply problem, but it's not necessarily overall a supply problem. And I think you know, the response of Canadians to, for example, what's happening in the Ukraine right now and opening their homes up to people who are being displaced by war is an example of how there actually is flexibility in the market. If we were to think of it that way, especially given the diversity of the number of the population that is precariously housed or homeless, it's quite a cross section of the community, really, and I suggest that there is room in the existing housing stock to increase the number of places for people who need it, who would be excellent tenants and would be really benefited from having access to a roof over their head. So I don't know how we get there and whether there's a role for the city in that, but it seems to me that there is that does exist as an option.
Jason, can I?
Yeah, please go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. If I could just add on to that, there was a program in Winnipeg that matched seniors who had space in their homes, and this, John, goes to your, we have enough space. It's just like we have enough food. We just don't know how to get it to people. We don't have the social structures, you know, that like, we have enough homes. We have enough roofs. And so in Winnipeg, the CBC did an article on this, and it is not, I don't think, an appropriate place for a city to weigh in, but a church group, a community group, you know, some sort of matching mechanism between seniors who are living on their own and could use, you know, a roommate, helping hand, et cetera, and students. That was the program, but that could be expanded. I think those are the things that we need to start thinking about as a community and stop thinking that government's going to solve this for us.
Thanks, Erin. And I think there's also a large piece in Canada. We've got to a certain place of thinking of what a home is and how much space you have as a home, and that doesn't actually exist in other parts of the world. And I think there's just a reckoning of some sort that people are going to have to wrap their minds around that, and the types of housing and the amount of space. And I think there's two questions that I'll get to here that may relate to that. One is about, is there anyone planning to start a co-op housing project in Nanaimo now that the feds have put money into the budget for co-ops? How can Nanaimo get some of that? Do any of you know of anyone doing that? That's obviously a type of community-driven housing. Anybody on the panel aware of that currently?
I am aware of a group who is organizing around a cooperative housing model. I haven't been in touch with any of them, but they're very active on Facebook. I know they did a site walk last weekend. I know some of the folks in the community who are kind of supporting this. So absolutely. And I think the 7th Street, I don't know if it's classified as a co-op, but there's some innovative housing models out there that I think we could learn from and grow.
Yeah, and I think we definitely have to lean into the non-traditional views of housing as we progress. Will we be seeing developments here where we locate multiple uses in the same complex, such as senior housing with childcare, those types of pieces? Do we know of anything related to that happening?
Yes, and yes. So I was chatting with our GM of planning a few weeks ago, and he said, we're never going to do a public build again that doesn't have something else in it. And I think this goes, you know, like we're spending public dollars here. If housing's going in, we want to make sure it has a daycare, it has library services, it has everything, because it's everyone's money. And that just makes sense to co-locate services. So we have a feasibility study of a South End Community Center going in, and very, very early stages, but I know that we are reaching out to all sorts of different folks who could co-locate in a place like a community center, whether that be housing or daycare or library or whatever. I would be shocked to see the city or really any municipality go forward with a singular use public building going forward. We just don't have the cash for it.
That's good to hear. I have one question for you, Erin, and then we will transition to the breakout rooms. And it's just around your experience as a first-term city councillor. When you were going in, you obviously would have been thinking about, what it might be like. The housing file obviously is a complex one. Is there anything that has surprised you? Is there anything that you've learned that, or just, was it like you thought it might be? Or what can you share with people who might be thinking of getting into municipal politics?
Okay. What can I share? So my buddy Don Bonner, my colleague, said that when he was so excited, and when he like ran at council hard, and he said it was like hitting a wall of jello. And sometimes the bureaucracy can feel like that. Like we have all of these ideas and all of this energy, and let's go. And the bureaucracy is kind of this like opaque thing, and it has so many rules and all of that. So be prepared for that. There's a reason that structure exists for a reason, and we all want that. That reason is good. It protects us all, for the bureaucracy to be a slow moving beast. But be prepared for frustrations along those lines. I've given up, I think, as I said in my last statement, thinking that government is going to solve this. I think that this is going to be, government is going to help, absolutely. And I mean all levels of government, including Nanaimo. But this is a community issue, and the community is going to have to solve it. Like BC Housing is, you know, they're doing amazing things in community. And as I said, the agreement or the MOU we have with them, we're holding it so precious. We're so grateful for it. We need 3 more. So the cavalry has come. The province has given us what they can right now. So what else are we going to do? And that's the kind of thinking that I'd like future politicians to kind of embrace. Thanks for asking, Jason.
Oh, thanks, Erin. Okay, we're going to, and thank you everyone for the questions. And I see there's some conversation going on there. Thank you. And we are capturing all of that. And obviously this is being recorded. We are going to transition to the breakout rooms. We'll probably have about 20 minutes or in those rooms before we come back just to wrap it up. There will be, I don't know, are we remaining with 5 groups, or are we going to have a little bit smaller?
I'm thinking 3 groups.
3 groups, okay. So we'll have one of the panelists in each room. There'll be some of our organizers there to help monitor and to take notes. We also have the option that you're able to put information straight into Jamboard. I believe Chris is sharing the links to those. Or you can have somebody there that's a note taker. Consider that we only have about 20 minutes and there's quite a few people in the group. So we try and share the airtime and think of one person that can report back from those groups. It might be the panelist, it might be someone else. And we're going to focus in on the question of, in the context of the upcoming municipal election, what should candidates know or do to work towards housing for all in our region most effectively? So focusing on that piece. Yeah, we'll send people out to the breakout groups and we will come back in about 20 minutes to share and wrap up. A second here for recording back on. We'll just give a second here for everybody to come back from the other groups.
The matrix is real.
Would anyone like to start, say, from breakout room 1 on just a very quick summary of a key idea that might have come from the conversation? It doesn't have to be the whole thing. Anybody like to share that?
There were sort of 2 ideas that were discussed at greater length. The first was talking about people dealing with some form of addictions and getting a sort of appropriate treatment more as a housing as a kind of group, because there is a gap identified by someone who knows more about this, and my apologies if I'm butchering his argument, but there's a gap in terms of what is currently being funded through either BC Housing or other models. And so looking to collaborate with local governments, Island Health, and possibly some nonprofits to have a community where people are provided support to get through their addiction, and then that next step in their lives. What does that look like? Where do they have support for housing for that? And the other thing was looking at seniors housing. How can we use one of the problems we have, which is single family homes taking up a huge amount of space, and try to use that as a way to actually provide support for seniors by having 2 or 3 generations on one property.
Thank you. I think, Catherine, you were going to share for us. We were delinquent. We didn't capture on the Jamboard, but Lori did capture notes for us that we will be able to share. Just on mute there, Catherine.
After 2 years, you'd think I'd know. We were a little bit more free form, but we talked about the problem of seniors and renovictions, the problem of, well, it relates to the whole problem of the commodification of housing, where investors come and do minor renovations and then evict the tenants who have been renting at lower rates. And it is creating a terrible hardship. And the problem of seniors who are homeless is not necessarily as widely recognized. We talked about the need for cooperation between all the levels of government. That is happening. But as Erin pointed out, there's not only the lack of resources, but also just how to tackle the problem. It's so huge, and there are so many other problems that are happening right now that it makes it difficult. Another topic was the fact that, on city council, there are some councillors who don't seem to realize what it's like for people who are living on the street, the terrible difficulties and the suffering that is happening, and the horrible existence that some people are having. And the point was made, those counselors are just looking at it from a different angle. They're not looking at it from, say, the social service angle. They're looking at it from the business point of view. And so they're seeing homelessness as disruptive to the businesses downtown, which it is. I think that's basically where we left it. I mean, it's, and as far as suggesting what counselors could do, we couldn't come up with any one idea, other than the ones of working in cooperation with other urban mayors and the province to influence the federal government and so forth.
That's actually a perfect segue for me, Catherine. Just before I go to the breakout group 3, is if you do have any last thoughts that haven't been captured around what the most important or critical thing a municipal candidate can do, add those in the chat, because we are gathering that. So while we're listening to someone from group 3, feel free to add those in the chat.
I don't, we can really designate someone. Trent, do you want to speak maybe on behalf of the group, just about what we talked about? We were fairly wide ranging as well. I'm putting him on the spot, Trent on the spot.
Yeah, I'll just flip back to the board and read it off.
Yeah.
So,
And you can keep it to the key piece. It doesn't have to be all of them. So.
That's probably good, because there's like a bunch. So the first thing is candidates should recognize that housing is a human right, and try to build the community sentiment that that lack of shelter is unacceptable, because you can only build housing for enough people if enough people want housing for enough people. And related to that is something that came up at the end, is that regressive activists online and in person are already working to boost fear of the unhoused and dehumanize them, as they did in the lead up to the last election. And we need to have progressive candidates rehumanize our neighbors. including those that are unhoused and those that are at a risk of being unhoused and those that just look like they might be unhoused. And in order to actually do something about housing, we need to recognize that market-based for-profit housing will never do what is unprofitable, which is provide housing below market rate. We need public and nonprofit housing, and know that through self-funding of housing, as pointed out in the recent policy note paper, can have a neutral or near neutral impact, or occasionally positive impact on city finances if land is available from municipal or provincial level or federal level at low lease rates. I brought up the Red Vienna model, which was Vienna's answer to the housing crisis brought on by the destruction of housing in the First World War and the Great Depression, where they built so much public housing that to this day, it's majority or near majority of housing in Vienna is still public housing. I've forgotten the name, but one of the guys was saying community agencies that have their own land face barriers to developing it because the BC housing often has specific zoning and parcel size requirements, and there's a few organizations in the Nanaimo area that have parcels that they can't build on because they're too small or in the wrong place, even though the place would be good for housing. It's not currently zoned thereof. Ben was bringing up that we need more people at provincial government level and in the city level, because working on the housing file, because the housing file is badly understaffed at the city and provincially.
That's a good one. That's a good one there, Trent, to end on. I think there are lots of great things from your group there. I really appreciate you sharing it. And those who haven't looked into the Vienna model, it's worth a look, definitely. Thank you to everybody. We are probably going to go a minute or so over, but not too bad, because the timeline got blown up early and then we worked around it, so it's all good. Just want to end with call to action that we do need candidates that are going to be willing to champion the things that Forward Nanaimo is bringing forward. We need volunteers across the board. We need people to get more involved in municipal politics. That's talking to council members, attending meetings, supporting champions in their work. Yeah, we just want people to, you guys want to be involved. That's why you're here on a Thursday evening. So we're encouraging you to talk to others as well about this. Trent's got his hand up. Go ahead, Trent.
I just wanted to mention to the group, I've talked about this to a couple of incumbents who aren't here, that I would be very interested in becoming involved in a formal electoral organization or civic party, and helping out with that, because we badly need one. But I'm specifically a socialist, so if anyone's interested. I don't know who the candidates would be. I don't know that any such party would want me as a candidate. So,
all right. Thanks, Trent. Just quickly, before we let you go and say thank you again, after you log off, there's going to be a short survey. We'd really appreciate if you took another moment to just fill it out and let us know your thoughts on the workshop. There are 2 more workshops upcoming in the series: May 4th, Building the Local Donut Economy, and May 10th, Climate Action and Care for the Environment. And then there will be a wrap-up event, most likely on May 27th, We're still trying to sort out the actual venue. It will be in person. And we'll share key takeaways from the workshops, have a chance to network, connect, and talk about the things that are going on and how to move it forward. So thank you, everybody that stuck it out for the full time. And thank you to our panelists and everybody that's been involved in organizing. Lots of great information and input. And I'm sure we will see you all in the near future. Thank you.
And a big thanks to the organizers of this webinar.
Thanks, everyone.